Hello and welcome to the MB Om podcast, where you will learn to master the business of yoga with guests from around the world who have experienced becoming successful yoga teachers, studio owners, and much more. Now, here's your host, Amanda Kingsmith.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the MBOM podcast. This episode of the podcast is brought to you by bookyogaretreats.com. Bookyogaretreats.com is my favorite source for finding retreats to participate in as a practitioner, as well as to book through as a teacher. It's an awesome resource because people are able to find retreats within the dates that they want, the locations around the world that they want, as well as in the price range that they want. So it has everything that we need as teachers and practitioners all on one website. To learn more about bookyogaretreats.com, visit mbomyoga.com/bookyogaretreats. All right, on to today's episode of the podcast. I am super excited to be joined by Jessica Winderl, who is joining me all the way from Norway. Jessica is originally American, but she currently calls Norway home, and she runs teacher training programs over in Norway. So she shares a little bit about her yoga story, how her yoga career advanced, and how she went from teaching regular studio classes like most of us do to making a sustainable living off of teacher training programs. And that's entirely it. So I am super excited to share this interview with you today, and I hope that you really enjoy it. Okay, without further ado, here's Jessica. I am very excited to be joined on the podcast today by Jessica Winderl, and she's joining me all the way from Norway, although from the U.S. originally. Welcome to the show, Jessica.
Thank you, Amanda. I'm really excited to be here with you.
And I was curious if you could tell us where in Norway you're joining us from.
Yes, I am actually sitting here in a hotel room in Oslo, so kind of more southern part, the capital of Norway. But I actually live in Trondheim, which is a college town about 6 hours north of Oslo, and sort of in the middle part of the country on the coast.
Wow, that's so amazing.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. So for me, going south means going to Oslo.
Is that kind of like the major shopping restaurant hub? I don't know much about Norway.
Yeah, it's so Trondheim is the third largest city. We have Oslo, Bergen, Trondheim, and because it's a university town, Trondheim actually has tons of restaurants and bars and cafes. I want to say there's probably around 60,000 people, which is a guess in Trondheim. And in Oslo, of course, because it's the capital, there are more people and just more happening. So there's definitely a lot of shopping, a lot of really cool areas to explore, little neighborhoods and cafes and restaurants and all that good stuff in Oslo.
Wow, that's so cool. It's definitely on my list to visit there someday.
It's beautiful. You should come.
Yeah, definitely. We were talking before I started recording this about how we both love mountains. So I think in the summer for sure for me, but I would love to see the fjords and the mountains and all of the beautiful landscapes there on top of seeing the city.
Yes, there is definitely a lot of nature to explore here, and the summertime is very gorgeous.
Amazing. And I want to get into how you transitioned from the U.S. to teaching over in Norway, but I want to back up a little bit to start with and talk a little bit about how you first got into yoga. Can you tell me a bit about that?
Yeah. So the very first time I tried yoga, I was 15, and my mother took me to our local YMCA, just, a little gym in our neighborhood. And like many teenagers, I did not connect to yoga. I hated it. It was really uncomfortable and awkward for me in my teenage body. And so I just kind of had this idea that that's what yoga was. It was really boring. I remember there were some blocks and there were a lot of older women in the class. So that was my first experience with yoga. And then fast forward, I was in my early 20s and I was living in a mountain town, and a girlfriend of mine was a yoga teacher, and we would have these conversations about yoga and life and the type of person we wanted to be. And she's like, gosh, Jessica, your philosophy on life sounds a lot like yoga. I really think you should give yoga another shot because I'm pretty sure you're going to love it. And so I was like, okay, you've convinced me. And I went and I took a yoga class, an asana class, and I walked out of that class and literally like my life changed course. It's like, oh, okay, I do yoga now. So that's a turning point. It literally was that fast for me.
That's amazing. And then after that, like initial, like, okay, like I'm a yogi, I do yoga now point, when did you decide to teach?
Well, this is such an interesting question because I know many people who start teacher trainings are unsure about if they're actually ever going to teach. I was so interested in the practices of yoga and meditation and Ayurveda that I just kept doing teacher trainings, like one right after the other. And I was like, oh, but I'm never going to teach. And for me, a lot of that was fear-based, where I thought being a yoga teacher was a very cool job and only cool girls got to teach yoga. So in the back of my mind, I was like, oh, that's fine. I'll just learn more about yoga for myself. And then, of course, myself and many other people who've had the same experience, the more you learn about yoga, a lot of us kind of subtly begin to teach. And then we find out, oh, surprise, we actually are indeed teachers. So for me, it was I started my first teacher training not too long after I started yoga, but with the intention of deepening my personal practice.
Okay. And how many teacher trainings did you do before you were like, okay, I have to share this. Like I have to share this with other people.
It was my third teacher training.
Wow. That's such a unique way to come into teaching yoga. I really think that that's super interesting.
Really? Because I think it's actually fairly common where people start teacher training and they're not sure if they want to teach, or they're kind of on the fence. And then by the time they leave a teacher training, they actually want to teach.
Yeah, definitely. I would agree with that. And I mean, you do teacher training, so I think that you would see that a lot more than I would, obviously. But just doing 3 before you decide to teach, I think that's quite unique.
Yeah, the number itself. Yes.
Yeah, that's amazing though. Doing that much learning for yourself without the intention of sharing it with other people and having that grow really naturally.
It is. And I really treasure that time in my studentship where I was so thirsty for the knowledge and guidance of yoga that I really dedicated myself to it. And the flip side of that, though, is the conversation that comes through with perfectionism. And as women and as yoga teachers, how we make peace with this idea of how do we take those leaps in our life and in teaching yoga, even if we're not necessarily ready, or even if it doesn't look perfect, or even if we don't say exactly the right thing at the right time in our yoga class. And so for me, I was one of those people. I suffered from this idea of perfectionism where I have to be the most educated. I have to have been practicing yoga for 25 years before I can even teach my first class. And I think that's kind of a dangerous message. We have to start somewhere. And so I really like to encourage new teachers to start, even if their voice shakes, even if they're nervous, even if they're not quite sure what they're going to say. So even though my personal experience started from one of kind of this, okay, I have to be the A+ student, I have to know exactly what I'm doing, I now can take my experience and offer some advice to new teachers and say, hey, it doesn't have to be that way. You don't have to wait until your third teacher training to start teaching yoga.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it's a conversation I had actually with one of the girls who was in my 200-hour teacher training. And she emailed me probably just about 6 months ago. And she was like, I still don't feel ready. And it's been a couple years. And she's like, is that weird? Is it normal? And I was like, well, there's nothing wrong with you. Of course. It's just, it's really scary for some people to think about going in front of a group of people and not saying the words as good as somebody else, or, maybe fumbling between your left and your right. And it's one of those things that we just all go through when we first teach a class.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, there are no shortcuts to becoming a solid teacher. The only way to do it is to get out there and teach. Yeah,
that's definitely true. And so when you did start teaching, what was that like, kind of like overcoming the perfectionism?
It actually came through a lot of self-study and making peace with myself and kind of creating this compassionate view of who I am and my gifts and what I have to offer to the world. And the teaching itself was not uncomfortable for me. I had a background in public speaking, and so that itself was not the problem. It was just my own mindset that was holding me back. So I was eventually able to step into the seat of the teacher by doing my own work.
And when you did do that, did you find that you had those moments where, you fumbled over your words, or you missed one side, or you said the wrong side? Like, did you still go through that?
A little bit, but honestly, for me, standing in front of the room and following my sequence, following my theme came fairly easy to me.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's awesome to hear.
I mean, of course I made mistakes, and I'm using that in air quotes, and I still do. I mean, when I teach classes currently, I still make little mistakes, but I just don't get flustered by them. I continue teaching, I move on, I don't draw attention to it, because honestly, most of the students don't even notice anyways. So it's really, again, having that compassion for the fact that as teachers, we're still human and we do make mistakes, but also having the confidence to stand in the power of holding the space as a teacher.
Right. Yeah, I love that. And I love that you used air quotes that, the audience can't see, of course, but air quotes for mistakes, because it's like calling them mistakes is not really even helpful. It's just part of the human experience and part of what we go through. And, that's just part of teaching as well.
Exactly.
And so you started teaching, and what did that look like? Like, were you a part-time teacher? Were you teaching full-time at that point?
I was teaching part-time.
Okay. And then you still had another job on top of that?
I did. So I kept my day job for several years while teaching yoga part-time before I transitioned into being a full-time yoga teacher.
Okay. Can you share a little bit about what that looks like working full-time while teaching part-time and then transitioning into that full-time?
Yes. There were a few years there where I was working insane amounts between my full-time corporate job and picking up more and more yoga classes, regular yoga classes on a schedule. And I also was transitioning into leading teacher trainings, which can be a large chunk of time, on the weekends or during the week. And so I also was living about an hour away from where the studios were that I was teaching in. So add on top of that, working 40 plus hours a week in your day job, teaching 6-7 classes a week, and then prep time and all of that, and doing some yoga teacher trainings, and now a commute. It was the American dream. Not really, but it's so funny because that's the hustle of yoga, where many of us who are entrepreneurs and are part of the yoga industry, we work so much and so hard, and that's not sustainable over long periods of time. And so for me, I knew that going into it. I was like, okay, I've got a couple of years here where I'm just going to grind it out and be really smart about planning my career path so that I could be teaching yoga for the rest of my life. And so for me, I just made the commitment to put my nose to the grindstone, work my corporate job, even though I disliked it, so that I had enough money to continue doing more trainings and continue learning about marketing and business plans and looking for new opportunities within the yoga industry to expand my career there, so that I wasn't just making a rash decision about trying to teach yoga full time when there wasn't the income to support it.
Right. Yeah. Wow. That sounds like just a crazy couple of years that you did that for.
Yeah. And, it's funny. My husband and I had met during the time period and were dating long distance. He was living in Norway and I was living in the US. And the first summer that he came to visit me and he saw how much I was working, like I left my house, 6:30 in the morning, and I usually didn't get home until anywhere between 10 and 11 at night. And he was just sitting there waiting for me. And he's like, Jessica, why am I even here visiting you? Because you're never home. And that was the first time I really actually had a light bulb go off about, oh, wow, I am working so much. And that's probably not a good thing. And in the US, that's really common to see people working that much, and your friends are working that much, and we all have side hustles, and we all are, trying to be creative, and we're trying to do these other things. And then you get the European perspective where a full work week is 37.5 hours with 5 weeks mandatory vacation, paid vacation. So then when my boyfriend at the time, started talking to me about that, I was like, wow, I need to really get in gear here and make some changes ASAP.
Mm-hmm. And so what did you do at that point?
Well, that's when I was ready to quit my full-time job and start teaching full-time. So it kind of all coincided at the same time, but my husband's acknowledgement of how much I was working was really like the last straw.
Right. It's like this person who really cares about you is like, I never get to see you when I'm here, and this is a bit, crazy.
Yeah. But I also would like to share a story to kind of illuminate my mindset about this, because in one of the teacher trainings I had done, there was a girl in the training with me, and she was about to start her final semester of university. And we were getting ready to graduate from the training, and she had fallen so in love with the practice of yoga and teaching yoga that she was like, you know what? I'm dropping out of university and I'm going to start teaching yoga full time. And to me, I was a little shocked. I was like, really? Do you think you're going to be able to support yourself? Are you going to be able to get enough classes or teach at enough studios or privates or whatever she was going to do to make a living? And especially when you're so close to graduating college. Mm-hmm. And she's like, oh, it's fine. It'll work itself out. And I'm not worried about it. And I always think about that because that's such a common phenomenon as well in the yoga world, from what I've observed, where we get so excited coming out of a teacher training and our whole world has been turned upside down. And we now want to go share this transformative experience with others. But we haven't quite realized the realities of teaching yoga and running a yoga business. If I didn't end up making as much money as I thought I was going to from teaching yoga, I could still pay my bills. And then it ended up being fine. I was making enough money from teaching yoga that everything did work out. But the moral of the story is I think it's really important to have all the details in front of you, to have all of the information before making a decision about making the leap from being a part-time yoga teacher to a full-time yoga teacher.
Yeah, definitely. I couldn't agree more. And you're the second person that I've talked to who's kind of done this, like, nose down. I'm going to grind until I've got enough classes and I've got enough opportunities that I feel like I'm in a financially stable place to actually drop the corporate job. And I worked alongside a girl who did that, and I watched her hustle, and it was crazy. Like, from a outsider's perspective, like, her life was so busy and so hectic, and she was just like she was grinding, full on grinding. And I was like, man, how long are you going to do this for? Because you're making me tired and I'm not even doing this. Did you reach a point at all where you were like, okay, I'm totally burnt out? Or was it just like, keep channeling this, like, this is, the light is there. I see it at the end of the tunnel. I'm almost there.
I have two answers to that question. The first one is, from the perspective of my corporate job, I saw the light at the end of the tunnel. I was really motivated for years to make this happen. And it's because once I did start teaching yoga and really stepping into my power as a teacher, I was just like, okay, I'm done. This is what I need to be doing. And so I was going to do whatever it took to make that happen, but in a very smart, educated way. But the point of burnout, and I'm so happy you brought this up. the second part of my answer about burnout came when I was teaching yoga full time. That actually was when I experienced burnout, not from my corporate job and teaching yoga part time.
Okay, interesting.
Which, yeah, I know that sounds like, okay, well, that's weird. But I think it has to do with the nature of how a lot of us end up teaching yoga, in terms of if we're working at different studios and we teach in the morning, then we have a break, and then we teach in the afternoon and we have a break, and then we teach an evening class. Our time gets eaten up in such a different way than when we go to an office setting and we're there from 8 to 5 or whatever. We're not banging out all of the hours. We're breaking them up. And then there's, of course, commuting, driving to this studio and that studio, and going to teach at Lululemon, or if you're going to teach at other places for free, or that actually became more draining than my previous situation.
Yeah, it's definitely, I'm glad that you brought that up, because I think that that's something that, a lot of people experience, is like, it seems like you're kind of living the dream when you decide to become a full-time yoga teacher. And, because being in a yoga class is so great, but then what you don't see as a practitioner is that hustle of running around, driving from studio to studio, being early, setting up classes, prepping, the fact that like, oh shoot, I forgot my lunch, or I didn't pack a snack. Now I have to go get something. Oh, I don't have time. Now I can't eat. And all of that stuff that just causes you to be so tired at the end of the day.
Right. And also what the average practitioner doesn't see is the back end office work that many yoga teachers are doing, because of how social media has taken over a lot of our marketing plans and how we receive information. A lot of yoga teachers now are spending a lot of time behind the computer, updating their Facebook page, posting on Instagram, replying to emails. Can you sub this class? Oh, can you teach at this event? Can you do this festival? And that can be really draining in a different way too, because there's always this sense of urgency. Like, today there's a class. Can you be there? Can you sub it? Can you cover it? And it's interesting to see how quickly, even just in the short time I've been teaching, how quickly the yoga industry has been transforming or changing in how the business of it is being run.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting that you bring that up, because I feel like social media is kind of this thing that's it's there, and it can be really overwhelming, but it can also be really beneficial for your business. It's a yoga teacher asked me the other day, she's like, do you think I need to be on Facebook? And I was like, well, I don't think you need to do anything, but I think it's pretty helpful if you want to, teach anywhere outside of, the tiny community that you're currently teaching in.
Exactly. And my big takeaway from this, leaving my corporate job, teaching yoga full time in the studio setting, and then realizing, oh, this actually is really draining. I need to do something else. So my takeaway is, as yoga entrepreneurs and yoga teachers, we need to constantly be evolving on the business side of things, so that we can find new ways to create income, new ways to stay motivated, and new ways to be more productive without turning our wheels and creating more work. So working smarter rather than harder.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. Can you talk a little bit about how you've done that for yourself?
Yeah. So as I was teaching yoga full time, and I was teaching teacher trainings and really trying to figure out, okay, what's the best career path I can create for myself that is authentic to who I am and my message, and is also going to be sustainable long term. And for me, that answer was teacher trainings, running them. It's my absolute favorite thing to teach. I get so lit up being in a group of students who are excited to be there and dive deeper into yoga and Ayurveda and philosophy. And, in a traditional studio class setting, it's very much a one-way dialogue. The teacher is saying, inhale, lift your right leg, exhale, low lunge. And of course, hopefully students have space for their own experience, because that's the point, but the teacher's talking the whole time. In a yoga teacher training setting, it's a dialogue. It's an open conversation. So we get to really hash out these ideas of yoga and the wisdom of yoga and what it means for us in modern society and how is it relevant to our day-to-day life now. And so I really started honing in on this idea. I was like, oh yeah, when I think about yoga teacher training, I get excited. So that was sort of a turning point for me where I was like, okay, I think it's time for me to create my own school. I've done enough training. I've been teaching long enough that I feel comfortable putting myself in that position and offering a service to students who now want to transition into the seat of the teacher. And I did that. So now my business is called the Atman Yoga School. And I run 200-hour foundational trainings, 340-hour advanced trainings, both of which are registered with the Yoga Alliance. And I also do weekend intensives. So I do restorative yoga trainings and Ayurveda intensives. And that's my focus.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so when you decided to start that, were you still based in the U.S.?
Yes, I was.
Okay. And can you tell me a little bit about like transitioning your business from the US to Norway?
Yes. Oh my gosh. Kind of a wild experience. So an interesting fact that many people may not be aware of who love to travel, as I know you do and I do. Mm-hmm. A lot of people have this misconception that if you marry a foreigner, somebody from a different country, you're automatically given a green card. And you automatically can move to that country and you have the same rights as a citizen. That is not true and has not been true for, 20 years or at least since 9/11. Mm-hmm. So when my husband and I decided that the U.S. was just not the place for us for a variety of reasons, and we decided to move to Norway, and I was immigrating here, I was not really eligible, even though we were married at that point, I was not really eligible to be given the equivalent of a Norwegian green card. So I actually am here on a work visa. Okay. It does not matter that I'm married to it doesn't even matter that I'm married to a Norwegian man. I'm here based solely on the merit of my business, my yoga school, that I brought to Norway. So when I found that out, I was like, okay, I got to make sure all of my ducks are in a row and that I've really presented my business in the best light possible in order to be granted this visa. And luckily, I'd already done so much of the work that it wasn't really a problem to convince the Norwegian government that I have a viable business. I'm going to make money. I'm not going to be a drain on their welfare system. And what that process looked like was a lot of paperwork. A lot of filing fees, a lot of back and forth with the immigration office, on top of the immigration that I'd already done in the U.S. for my husband. So it's paperwork. Yeah, that's the unsexy answer.
Yeah,
of how I moved my.
Yeah, and for anyone who hasn't done like any process like that, my boyfriend had a work visa in the U.S. a couple of years ago, and it's very confusing, and maybe the Norwegian government is different, but I found between like the Canadian and the U.S. government, it's like, oh, you need this form, but there's like a tiny little like asterisk that's like, oh, if you have this condition or this case, like it's this paperwork too, and you fill out this section and not this section, and I just feel like it's very confusing. Like it's not like you sit down and just like write your name and fill out your information and send it off. It's like a lot of like little details.
Oh, it is. And it's maddening. You sit there and you want to pull your hair out. And I don't speak Norwegian. So when I would call the immigration office and have a question about a form or something, many of the Norwegians do speak excellent English, but not all of them. And then you're trying to ask about this complicated form and they don't quite have the correct English translation for their specific process. And it was tricky, but, what ended up happening was my work permit actually got approved really fast, like within 2 weeks.
Oh, amazing.
Because I'd gone, and unheard of. I'd gone overboard on providing way too much information. And I could prove that I was creating enough of an income for myself and there was a big enough market in Norway. But Norway is actually a very bureaucratic system because it's very much based in socialism to some degree, or social. I sound so ignorant, and I apologize to any Norwegians who are going to be listening to this, but I'm not exactly sure of the form of government.
That's okay.
That's yet to be determined when I do my permanent residency stuff that I've got to do. But that aside, it's not very friendly for entrepreneurs. So a lot of people, when I would call the immigration, and because I'm a sole proprietor of my business, they wouldn't understand a lot of the unique problems I was having. And even though my work permit got approved right away, I actually wasn't fully integrated. Like, I didn't get a personal number until like October, like almost I don't know, what would that be? 8 months later.
Wow.
Because the tax office and the immigration office could not decide who needed to give me this personal number because I was a sole proprietor and it was such a unique situation. So they were going back and forth. And meanwhile, in Norway, if you don't have a personal number, you can't get a cell phone. You can't open a bank account. You can't get paid. So I was in Norway legally working. I just couldn't get paid for it.
Jeez.
Yeah. So that was, another thing. I had to have an assistant teacher in my school collect all the payment. And then after I finally got a bank account set up, then she gave me all the money. And so that part was really frustrating. So the work permit, no problem, but actually getting integrated into the society was much trickier because I owned my own business.
That's so interesting. And so now that you've been there for, did you say 14 months?
Yeah, about 14 months.
So I guess it's been like 6 months since all of that got sorted. Do you feel like you've been able to integrate a little bit more into the culture and into society there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to. That's a really important part of it too. I really like Norway, and the yoga community in Norway in particular is fascinating because it's growing very quickly and there's not really enough teachers here. So for me, bringing my business to Norway was actually really perfect timing.
Yeah, that's super interesting to hear. And I feel like that must have been really different from like the market in the US, because I feel like there are a lot of yoga teachers, and there's almost more yoga teachers than there are jobs in a lot of different communities. It sounds like it's very different from that in Norway.
That's exactly right. In the US, I mean, the market is so saturated and it is really hard to find jobs and hard to keep jobs too, in many ways in the US, just because there's always fresh blood coming up. And in Norway, Norwegians are so interested in yoga. And even so, I taught my first workshop in Norway about 5 years ago when I was dating my husband. And every time we came to Norway, I would teach workshops here. So since I've been coming to Norway to teach, to when I now live here, I've seen a huge increase in the number of practitioners and people who are like, oh, that's really cool. I like yoga. And even one thing more interesting about that from the American Canadian perspective is Vinyasa yoga is very new here. There are very few Vinyasa teachers, which is the main style that I teach. And so my school is the only school in Norway that does a dedicated Vinyasa yoga teacher training.
Wow, that's so cool.
Where in the States, it's like Vinyasa is pretty much all you can find without looking too hard.
Right. Yeah, definitely. That's such a different change. What was it like as a business owner to go from this like saturated market where it's like you teach something that's very common to being in a very unsaturated market where something you teach is very unique?
First of all, it's really exciting from the business perspective to have a market that's wide open and to have a product that you really believe in and that you know people are going to be excited about also. So for me, that's just the best. I mean, for any business owner, I think that would be the best, to be able to walk into a market that's open. Mm-hmm. But flip side of that is the education component. So a lot of people here, because they have not really been exposed to a Vinyasa style of asana, are not really sure what it is. So I've found that a lot of my work is actually letting people know what Vinyasa is and how do you explain it. And if they can't come to take a class with you, then how do they know what it is? So that's been my challenge.
Yeah, that's so interesting. That must have been such a big shift going from like, okay, everyone knows kind of what this style is in North America versus like, okay, my biggest sell now is this is what this is.
Yeah, that's something that most yoga teachers don't really have to think about because like you said, everybody already knows what that style is like. And you say vinyasa and people say, oh yeah, amazing. Here you say vinyasa and actually people think you're talking about Ashtanga vinyasa.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah, which is not as how it's commonly referred to in the States. The practice of Ashtanga, the physical practice of Ashtanga, the Mysore practice. In the States, we call it Ashtanga. Here it's called Ashtanga vinyasa. And so I get emails all the time from people who are interested in doing teacher trainings with me. And their question is, will I be certified to teach Ashtanga Vinyasa? And I just chuckle a little bit because that right there is an indication of how much work I have to do on educating yogis in Norway about what Vinyasa is. And I'm not the only Vinyasa teacher here. I'm just the only one with a Vinyasa teacher training.
Okay. Wow. That's so interesting to hear.
Yeah. So people think they're going to be certified to teach the primary series when they graduate my training, which they're obviously not. I'm not an Ashtanga teacher.
Right.
So then sending them an email back and being like, well, Vinyasa is quite a bit different.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And then have you found that there are any other differences running a business over in Norway versus the US, like in terms of how like marketing or sales or, how receptive people are to it?
They're not. Well, what I will say is I think running a business in Norway is complicated to get set up, but once you do, it actually is easier than running a business in the US. And the reason for that is the government's involvement and regulation in the finance sector here in Norway. So, for example, I'm a sole proprietor, so I pay my taxes quarterly, which is common in the US and maybe in Canada. But at the end of the year, when I submit my annual tax return that I have an accountant prepare for me, they actually get a copy of my bank information. So they see like my business credit card. They knew, the government, the tax government, knew exactly how much money I had spent on my business credit card that is held at a private bank.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then they actually accounted for that as, whatever the balance was on the day they took it. They credited that as a debt against my business. Where in the US, people would be up in arms about the government getting a hold of their private bank information, just as a routine tax year in, year out thing.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. When I saw that, I was kind of shocked. I was like, oh my gosh, the government's like really tracking me here in Norway. But it actually made it much easier for me to file my taxes because all of the information was in one place. So from my end, it was much faster. It's like, oh, actually, it's kind of nice that they have my information. One less thing for me to do.
Yeah. Yeah. My first reaction to that was like, whoa, no. But
me too. Yeah. It's like Big Brother's watching. And then you think about it and you're like, oh, actually, that's really nice that, okay, cross it off the to-do list.
Right. Because I guess, do you have to still do all your expenses then, or can you just use that amount from your credit card?
Well, my accountant still specifically deducted my expenses. So it's the same where you keep your receipts and you give them to your accountant or you do the deductions yourself. So that part's very similar, but
okay.
just the idea that the government is able to access a lot of your personal information in ways I wasn't used to threw me off.
Yeah, for sure. That's totally fair. I feel like you even saying that kind of was like, whoa, to me. So.
Exactly. So that was one interesting thing. But other than that, we do marketing the same way here. It's mostly all online and digital and Facebook groups. And, I have websites and word of mouth.
Yeah.
So there's not really any big differences in the marketing that I've observed.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great to hear. Yeah. I wasn't sure if maybe, things were different over there. And of course, I know it's, it's Europe. It's not like somewhere crazy, but you never know with societies what things are like trending and what's popular. And if, Instagram's less popular or Facebook's more popular, or, like sending direct mail is still common there. So yeah, it's interesting to hear that it's pretty similar to over here.
Yeah, no direct mail.
Thank God for that.
Yeah, thank God for many reasons. But yeah, Instagram's huge. It's all the same. I mean, the global economy is so integrated, I think, at this point, that even within the yoga community, everything's pretty much the same.
Yeah, which is
at
amazing.
least in Western areas. Yeah, thankfully for me, I had enough going on trying to figure out being in a new country and getting situated, making sure I was doing everything by the book from the government's perspective.
Yeah, definitely. That's so much, right? It's like you're already running a business, which is like a lot of moving parts, and then moving that to a different country is like a whole other ballgame.
Yeah. And one thing I'd like to point out too, not just for myself, but for anybody who's a yoga entrepreneur, is it really takes a lot of courage to take these kind of risks and think outside the box and try things on. And if something doesn't work, okay, then you take a right. If that doesn't work, you take a left. And having that resilience to keep going is so important. And I think we forget that sometimes. We're just so used to having a society moving quickly. And if something doesn't work, get rid of it. Your marriage doesn't work, get divorced. But if you want to have a sustainable career in the yoga industry, I think no matter where in the world you live, you have to be okay with failure, or setbacks at least, and keep going, put one foot in front of the other. And, I look back at this last 14 months for me, and, as a side note, I also went through cancer treatment at the same time, totally wild, but I'm really proud of where I'm at. And it's because I haven't really given up, even though it was hard, even though I had to call the tax office in Norway and speak to somebody in Norwegian, and I think that's the big takeaway is we can draw strength and inspiration from one another in the yoga industry and the business of yoga by seeing what other people are doing and seeing them take risks.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I think that is something that it's important to acknowledge and important to talk about. Like, it can be really challenging to be an entrepreneur and to be a yoga entrepreneur. And it's also scary to put yourself out there. And it's scary for everyone who does it. It doesn't just like come naturally to everyone who's out there creating stuff or, developing a business, and just continuing to like look at your end destination and just move slowly towards that is so key. Right.
And also as yoga teachers, we are our brand, and that's a very vulnerable place for a lot of people to be. Most people actually. And I shared with you before we started recording, today was day 6 of an 8-day intensive that I'm teaching here in Oslo. And my group of students, I had them write bios. They're about to graduate from my 200-hour training. And I had them write bios. So when they are applying to studios or getting jobs, they have something ready to go. And also to get them thinking about what kind of a teacher they're going to be as they present themselves to the community at large. And of course, their feedback today when we were reviewing the assignment was, oh my gosh, this was so hard. Like, how do you talk about yourself? And I was like, yep, absolutely. That's how we all feel. And it gets a little easier with time, but we have to start somewhere, and getting over that hump of putting ourselves out there as business owners, as yoga teachers, realizing that, very few people are actually going to be paying that much attention. If we're honest, if we cut our ego down a little bit, and, just having that courage to put ourselves out there and be like, okay, if you want to teach yoga, you could be the best teacher in the world, but if nobody knows where to find you, or they don't know where you're at, you're never going to have any students. And then you're never going to be able to be of service to those students. So we have to get over the fear of self-promotion.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And it's like I mean, it's scary. It's like scary to put yourself out there because there's people online who are not so nice, but it's trusting in yourself and what you have to say and your own personal brand, and just finding the people who do resonate with what you have to say and who you are.
Right. There is a teacher for every student. And if somebody doesn't like you or they don't like the style of yoga that you teach, that's fine. That's fine. It doesn't matter. They're not meant to be your student. But it's one thing between intellectually understanding that and then emotionally understanding that.
Totally.
Being like, okay, that hurt my feelings a little. All right, keep going. One foot in front of the other. It's okay.
Yeah. And I think it kind of triggers this like, oh, is there something wrong with me? Like that's kind of the initial reaction. But then it's coming back to this place of like, I always come back to the place of like, I don't like practicing with every yoga teacher. And I don't think that they're bad people. It's just like, I don't really like your style, or, it's not my favorite class to go to, and that sort of thing. There's nothing wrong with them. And I think that it's great that they're offering what they're offering because somebody else probably resonates with them. And as soon as I come back to that, it's a lot easier as a teacher to be like, okay, it's going to be the same way when I stand in that place of being a teacher.
Yes. So true.
But totally easier said than done.
Yes. Oh man. It's hard when our emotions and our ego come into play, and not even, the narcissistic part of the ego, but just yoga is teaching yoga is such a personal offering, and we pour our heart and our soul into it. And so when somebody doesn't resonate with our message, it can feel very personal. Even though, like you just said, it's actually not personal. It's just for whatever reason, it didn't strike a chord with us, and that's fine.
Yeah, definitely. Totally. I'm glad that you brought that up because I think it is a really important thing for yoga teachers to be reminded of, because it's easy to doubt yourself, and it's easy to, especially if you're new, it's easy to kind of think like, oh, maybe I should change something, but it's not that at all. It's just remembering that, if that person doesn't want to come to your class again, that's okay. They'll find a teacher that serves whatever they need in that moment.
Yeah. And keeping your heart open as a teacher, even when you have setbacks, or even when you have, people not come back to your class or leave a mean comment, or which hopefully they're not, but like you said, there are people online who are really mean and brutal, and we can't control that. But keeping your heart open, even in the face of some of these, kind of heavier emotions, can be tricky. And I think that's also something that plays into burnout that teachers eventually may or may not experience, is because it's hard to put yourself out there day in and day out and not get impacted by all this stuff coming your way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. That's so true. I haven't really thought of burnout like that before, but I think that definitely makes sense. It's like, you're being very vulnerable when you're teaching and offering, and if somebody kind of doesn't like that or doesn't resonate with that, it can be kind of hard to take that and just sit with it.
Yeah. And I think it actually, the way that it leads to burnout is it just wears you down over time. Even if you're not really taking it personally, I think the fact that you're putting so much of your energy out there, and, most yoga teachers are coming from a very loving place with their offerings. It's just a lot of emotion going out, even if teachers are doing their self-care rituals. I think it's the natural way of how we teach yoga.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I think that you're really right on that. We've kind of talked about this a little bit already with transitioning your business over to Norway, but I'm wondering if you can talk about some of the other big business challenges that you've experienced as you transitioned from, full-time corporate to part-time yoga teacher to full-time yoga teacher to not teaching these studio classes and really just like digging into running teacher trainings.
Well, for me, I've actually covered most of my challenges, which were coming to Norway and educating the yogis here about what a vinyasa style of yoga is, and jumping through the bureaucratic hoops that I had to. I guess that the other big challenge that I encounter is really self-imposed. And so it's something that really excites me, but it also is like, oh my gosh, okay, So moving to a country where the yoga community is still growing so quickly, and there's a lot of space for yoga teacher trainings and educating new yogis to become teachers, the sky's the limit. And this is true for all yoga teachers and all entrepreneurs, of course. Like, we are kind of the masters of our own destiny, meaning if we aren't willing to keep hustling, keep working, keep putting offerings out there, keep updating our website, keep thinking of new curriculum or new workshops, we might skate by for a while, but eventually our career might kind of peter off. So we have to always be thinking about the next thing. What's the next retreat or the next training I'm going to do? And here in Norway, because I feel like there's a lot of room, it's almost a scary thought of like, okay, wow, I can go as far as I want to with offering things through my online yoga school, but I'm just one person and I get tired and I run out of steam. And so it's really trying to manage my wild dreams that I'd love to build Atman Yoga School into, while also being really realistic about my time and my energy, and trying to be really smart about how I use my time when I sit down to the computer. So trying not to get distracted in Facebook or checking Instagram and just being like, okay, sit down. You only have a few hours to put together this proposal and send it off to the graphic designer for the flyer that's going to get made. And you've got to respond to these emails about, I'm already booked out trainings for 2019. And so it's a lot of planning. And so for me, the challenge is, how do I not get overwhelmed with possibility?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Because it's like,
which I know
it's exciting, but it's scary. It is overwhelming.
Yeah. And I know that sounds kind of like a luxury problem to have, but it's not just me and my situation. I think it's all entrepreneurs and all yoga teachers, and maybe even more so in markets that are saturated, where you really have to take that extra effort to distinguish yourself or to let people hear your offering above the screaming of every other yoga teacher and their offerings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that it's interesting that you brought that up. And I think that it could be maybe like a luxury problem, but I think it's also something that's very real. And I think entrepreneurship has these interesting like ups and downs, where if you don't put much into your business, I feel like you don't see the return. But then when you put, effort and hustle into it, it's like you get all this stuff that comes back. But sometimes that can be really overwhelming. Like if you send a bunch of emails and you get all these responses, or you do like a big marketing push for something you're doing, and then you have like 50 emails to deal with, it's kind of like, oh man, it was almost easier when I had no emails, even though it's not like the place you want to be in, I guess you could say.
Absolutely. And I do think it's important to talk about what happens when you start getting success as a yoga teacher and an entrepreneur, because, we're always talking about the struggle and the hustle and burnout, and all of that is so true and so relevant. But I know for me, when I kind of turned a corner a little bit with my business, I was in really unfamiliar territory. I was like, oh my gosh, okay, this is strange and new. And now what? Was the big question. And it's just a different set of problems. And I'm not saying problems in a bad way. I'm just saying problems that might have an alternative solution to them. Yeah, like what you said, if you send out an email or a marketing campaign and you get 50 responses in an hour, you're just like, okay, wait, now what is the...
Yeah, definitely. I think it is important to talk about that, because I think there can be like a fear of failure, but there can also be kind of like this fear of success as well. Cause it's like diving into a pool that you've never been in, or diving in not knowing how to swim and being like, okay, I'm just going to like trust that I'm going to float to the surface, and that, everything's going to be okay with this, and that I'm going to figure it out.
Right. And once your business gets to a place that's sustainable, it is very true that you oftentimes encounter different problems. And in problems that you never even expected. Like not the same problem of like, okay, now what? I have 50 emails to respond to, but maybe you are changing tax brackets, or maybe you now have different accounting requirements. There's just things that you might have never thought about that now you have to think about. And I love that because it's so exciting to be an entrepreneur, even though it's very much feast or famine for most of us.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's like a fun adventure, but then it's also, I don't know if you ever have this, but there's some days where I'm like, man, maybe I should have just stayed in my corporate job. It was a lot easier. It was very cushy.
Yeah. And it's somebody else's problem. Like you show up, you do your work, you go home, you get a paycheck every 2 weeks, automatically deposited into your account. But I don't know. I think, and especially for our generation, we want a little bit more. We want something different. We want to be more in control of our destiny. And in order to do that, we have to be entrepreneurs.
Definitely. Yeah. My boyfriend and I were just actually talking about that last night. It's kind of like, I think our generation is one of the first generations where we have like all of our basic needs met for the most part and in North America. And we're very fortunate to have that, which gives us, we kind of do want more because now we're like, okay, we can go to the grocery store and we can get all of our food. So like that need is met. It's like housing. Okay, we can get these good jobs because we're educated and then we have money to afford rent. Okay, what's next? Like there must be something more. And so we're really lucky in that way, or we're really fortunate in that way that we've grown up like that for the most part, and that we have this ability to kind of like spread our wings and fly a little bit. It's pretty cool to be a part of.
I agree. It's really cool to be a part of. And it's funny. I remember when I was starting my corporate job and I was like, God, I would never want to be an entrepreneur. That sounds terrible. You have to do your own taxes and you have to do your accounting and your bookkeeping and you have to be in charge of everything. And I look back at that sentiment and that memory now and I just laugh. I'm like, oh my gosh, if I was still in my corporate job today, I would be so miserable. So even though I had to learn how to do accounting and bookkeeping, and I will tell you what, YouTube is like my favorite resource ever.
It's the best.
If I don't know how to do something business related, I always look it up on YouTube. And so it's funny how our perspective can change over time. But I agree with you that I think it's very much our generation where we're like, okay, what else?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think it's interesting for older generations. I don't know what your experience has been like with your parents and your grandparents, but I feel like there's sometimes like, is it like ever just going to be like, is a job just going to be good enough for you? And I'm like, just like, want that next thing, or I'm striving for something different. And I feel like it's kind of hard for them to completely comprehend that because it's not how they grew up and it's not how they live their lives.
Definitely. My parents at first were a little nervous about my choice to become a full-time yoga teacher. They're like, well, but what about your IRA account? And what about your retirement and all this stuff? And absolutely, I agree with that. We as a generation, I think, need to be more concerned about our plans for retirement.
Probably.
And I do think that a lot of the older generations are not quite understanding where our drive is coming from and where our risk-taking gene is coming from. But I think it's coming from a place of, there's that saying, let's see if I get it right. I think it's an Anais Nin quote where when something becomes painful enough, that's when we create change. It's along those lines. That's not quite it. But I think that's kind of the truth for a lot of our generation, where what has become painful for us is not that our basic needs have not been met. It's actually that we're having a bit of a spiritual crisis. And we need to find ways that make us feel alive, that make us feel in charge and control of our lives. And working for the man at your corporate job doesn't cut it anymore.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely relate to that.
Yeah, we need to have experiences. We need to travel. We need to meet other people and think outside the box with how we view ourselves and our relationship to the global community. Definitely.
Yeah. It's such a fascinating topic. I feel like I could just talk about that all day. It's like one of the things that I'm super interested in. It's interesting to think about.
Yeah, well, you travel so much and live abroad so much that I bet you have a really interesting perspective on it too.
Yeah, definitely. I'm sure you too, living in like another culture in another country and having the experiences of being over in Europe, for sure. I think that travel really gives you that, or really allows you to see the world a little bit differently. I think travel for me was like kind of the thing that kind of initiated me thinking outside the box, because I was very much on a conventional path until then. And I was like, oh, people do other things with their lives. That's cool.
Yeah, it's a catalyst for sure. Catalyst for change.
That's the word I was looking for. I was thinking stimulus came to mind, and I was like, I don't think that's right. That's not the right word. And so I want to be mindful of your time, but I'm curious if you have any other business lessons that you've learned throughout your career that you want to share with listeners.
No, I mean, I think I covered most of what my experience has been, which is putting one foot in front of the other and continuing to show up for my dream and my vision. And sometimes it's really hard and it's not very sexy and it's just the daily grind. But if you truly have a passion to be an entrepreneur, and specifically be a yoga entrepreneur, you got to stick with it, because it is not an easy path. One thing I would like to leave you and the listeners with is a book that I'm reading right now. And it's so good. It's called Grit: Why Passion and Resilience Are the Secrets to Success, by Angela Duckworth. It's a #1 New York Times bestseller, so it's all over the place. But it's about what sets us apart from people who are successful and versus people who are not. And she's determined, she did all this research and was a psychologist for years. And she determined that what makes people successful is this idea of grit. And grit is showing up day in and day out, even when it's hard, even when you don't get a pat on the back, even when you're feeling so challenged and down to your last $5 in your bank account, you stay with it. And that's what sets people apart who end up being successful. And so I think that's really true. That's been my experience.
Yeah, and definitely. I'm going to check that book out for sure.
Yeah, highly recommend it.
Cool. Yeah, I'm always looking for stuff like that. So I made a note of it. I think I'm actually going to order it when we get off this call.
Yeah, you won't regret it.
Yeah, it sounds right up my alley. So it sounds like a good book to be reading as somebody who's building a business.
Yes.
Amazing. And so where can people go to find out more about you, Jessica?
I have 2 websites. I have my personal website, which is just my name, jessicawinderl.com. And then my business website is atmanyogaschool.com. Atman is ATMAN, Atman. And Instagram is a great place to find me, Jessica Winderl, super simple. And I do have Facebook groups and pages, but I'm not really using them so much. People can find me, but Instagram or website.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today. It's been such a pleasure chatting with you. I'm really, really glad that we were able to connect.
Me too. Thank you so much for having me on. And it was so fun. I love talking about yoga and the business of yoga.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. Thank you so much, Jessica.
Yeah. Have a great day.
All right, everyone. I hope that you enjoyed that episode of the podcast. I know I really enjoyed having that conversation, as always. And before you run off, just a quick reminder that you can find show notes and blog posts over on the website at www.mbomyoga.com. I'm always interested in questions, comments, or feedback. So if you have something that you want to share or ask, you can send me an email at info@mbomyoga.com. You can join me on social media on Facebook and Instagram at Mastering the Business of Yoga. And you can join the private Facebook community at Yoga Business Badasses. Just search that in Facebook or click the link on the show notes or in the description for this episode and request to come in, and I'll approve you. And looking forward to seeing you there. As always, thanks so much for listening, and namaste.